Hey, let's get started. I'm going to do just a little bit of housekeeping and then introduce our panelists. If somebody would just let me know you can hear me in the chat, that would be great. Make me feel better. There we go. Okay, so this webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to all the registrants following the webinar, probably be a day or so after it. We're going to start with a presentation of the key findings of this report that we'll be talking about in a second. Then there'll be some discussion between the panelists, and we'll follow it with a live Q&A from you. So throughout, just put your questions in the chat and we'll be collating them and sharing them with the panelists. Our host today is going to be Fabrice Sergent, who is the managing partner and co-founder of Bandsintown. And he said he's in there under my name somehow. He hit my Zoom link. So if you see two Bruce Houghtons, there's truly only one of them, and the better looking one is Fabrice. And our other panelists are Kriss Thakrar, who is the research consultant at MIDiA, who we partnered with to do this study, and I'll talk about it in a second. And also Tatiana Cirisano, who is the senior music industry analyst and consultant at MIDiA. So very quickly, Bandsintown worked with MIDiA, providing data for them to do this landmark study of live music, the state of it currently, and then to give some indication of where it's going. And so we'll just kick off with Kriss, who's going to run over the basic findings of the study. And then after that, Fabrice will take over and start the discussion, and we'll feed the questions, the Q&A questions to him. So jump off, and Kriss, all yours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bruce. And hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. Hello, everyone. And yep, so I'm going to just share the PowerPoint, and yeah, if you can just give me a shout in the chat that you can all see that okay, and that, you know, you can see this beautiful title here. Yep, good to go. Brilliant. So thank you, Michael. Awesome. So yeah, we're here to talk about the return to live and the post-pandemic music fans. And just a bit of context around what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about what this study actually was and what this project involved, who we ended up surveying and what those fans look like, and how with the results of this survey, we essentially built out profiles of the post-pandemic music fans and looking at what do fans look like today in live music. And when we dug into these different types of profiles, we're able to start extracting different kinds of implications for the market. And that's why we've also got this Q&A here today, because we can start talking about what it means for you. And yes, feel free to just chime in, throw it in there. Fabrice is going to be digging them all up, and we're going to get into it towards the end. So that's us, and my colleague here as well, Tatiana. Do you want to introduce yourself quickly as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Tatiana here. I'm an analyst and consultant at MIDiA based in New York. It's really amazing to see such a wide range of different countries represented and different types of folks in the music industry. So thank you guys all for joining us. I'm really excited to share these findings with you.
Awesome. So let's get into it. So I think the first thing that we want to cover is, what was the study and what did it look like? And what did we find just by looking at this kind of demographic view of the audience? So as you can see, sort of right there at the bottom, we've got this Bandsintown live music survey, which was fielded to Bandsintown users. We got almost 2,700 live music fans to fill out the survey for us. And that's what you're seeing right here in all of this data. And you're able to see, yep, on the age, how it's distributed. You know, we've got quite a big chunk of the audience being over 45 years old. And I know that for a lot of people, there's this kind of image in your head of, you know, live music being about youth culture and young people going out to gigs. Definitely not the case. We've seen it in our own MIDiA surveys as well, where we field to around 9,000 people across the world. We track live music behaviors in that as well. And yeah, we're able to see that it is a real mixed bag when it comes to age distribution, the average age, being roughly around the mid-40s as well. And it might not be a surprise to many of you in the audience that rock music is the most seen genre in live music, followed by indie as well. And it really is dominating the live music landscape, and particularly for that over fives audience, which is really making up the bulk of that rock music attendance. In this project, we will get into some of the ways this is shifting and how younger audiences under index for what you might think as a typical, kind of rock concert that a lot of live music we're seeing right now is made up of. So keep that in your mind. And then the venues too. So theater and concert halls, that real kind of mid-range part of the live music industry is really making up the sort of bulk of concert tickets bought. But it is still popular for, arenas, clubs as well. And we can get into how this is all going to differ based on the different types of live music audiences too. And to just get a quick view into that, I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Tati now, and you can get into how does this differ across the genres and how the audiences are changing.
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, we saw a lot of differences emerge when we started to look at the audiences for different genres. So just for context here, the question that this comes out of is we asked, which of the following genres do you most often see live? And the respondents could select up to 3. So that's sort of, this isn't just rock fans, it's a little bit of a subtler difference where it's people who go to see rock shows live. And those things don't always align. The country data, all of this is from US and UK throughout this whole report. So it doesn't always necessarily align the music that you're a fan of listening to and what you're going to see live, which was an interesting insight here. But rock, as Kriss was saying, is definitely the most popular genre to see live. It tends to lean towards a bit older audiences, and they over-index for these bigger venues and things like meet and greets, which I think shows that this reflects the older generation's enduring fandom of those sort of legacy rock acts. And it's no surprise, I think, the hugely successful tours for, bands like Metallica and Guns N' Roses over the past few years. I think we see this as a reflection of that part of the market. Then we have all these other genres. So indie and alt has a bit of a younger audience, but it is interesting to us that the live music circuit is still very much driven by band music, whether it's rock or indie or alternative. There's also some interesting skews here with gender. I think maybe we expected pop would have a bit more of a female skew, but something like hip hop, I didn't expect to see 61% of the live audience being female, or for country, 55%. And then the other thing here, I think, was looking at how these genres have different homes physically in different types of venues. So for example, electronic is really owning, the club and music festival space, whereas country playing at a lot of bars and things like that. And sort of on that note, which I'll pass over to Kriss to talk about a bit more, hip hop was a very interesting case because obviously we all know that on streaming, hip hop is one of the most popular genres by far. And it's also where younger audiences are going. So I think for 16 to 19s, their top genre was pop instead of rock. And they tended to over-index for hip hop as well. Yet only 12% of concert goers said that they actually go to hip hop shows. And even when we looked at the younger audiences, they still weren't going to that many hip hop shows, reflecting that maybe not all genres need to be anchored in the live experience. There's sort of been this conventional knowledge that live is always the cornerstone of an artist's career, but there are more ways than ever, I think, for artists to find their audiences and find their fans, and maybe live is not always the home for all genres. So I'll pass it over to Kriss to talk a bit more about that for hip hop, but just to note with this, there's so much we could go into by genre, and we don't have time to, but if you do have specific questions, pop them in the chat and we'll try to answer them. Over to you, Kriss.
Yeah, thank you. And the one thing I probably would say with the hip hop fans, hip hop attendees, is that they are very selective with their ticket purchases. And with that selectivity, there's a big overlap with the pop audience as well. So if you are someone who is in that 12%, it's almost a better way to look at it would be to look at that 12% plus the 38% for pop audiences too. So essentially you're looking at, you know, a 50% type of audience there where it does skew younger, it does skew female, and they do purchase less tickets but spend more, and that's because they are buying for these big acts in arenas, at stadiums, also, you know, potentially at festivals and meet and greets too. And so that is quite a different behavior from what you might see in the indie and alternative audience, which, you know, is a bit older, but is also looking at, you know, spending more on frequent purchases, going to clubs, going to bars, and then maybe their big purchase will be at a theatre or concert hall. And it's really this type of dynamic and behavior that gets us into our profiles. And before we get into that, I'll pass this back into Tati to talk a bit more about what is driving the ticket buying in the first place.
Yeah, so we found when you look at this headline, fandom drives ticket buying, it might not sound that groundbreaking. Of course, artists are going to shows for artists that they like. I mean, sorry, fans are going to shows for artists they like. But I think there's actually a lot of nuance when we start to look more deeply into this question. So the question this is referring to, we asked, thinking about concerts you've attended over the last year, what most made you want to attend them? Select up to 3. And as you can see, by far the most popular response was it was one of their favorite artists with 88%. I think the steep drop from that top response to the second most popular of it being just an easily accessible location at 44% just goes to show how much fandom is really coming into the picture, where for a lot of fans, they're willing to, you know, shell out a lot of money and travel and go to places that aren't so accessible just because fandom is really what is driving their ticket purchasing. In fact, we also found that 41% of all respondents here would be willing to fly to see their favorite artists perform if they could not do so locally. So a couple of things come out of this. I think one interesting point is that discovery is more often happening off the live circuit and fandom building off the live circuit to the point where by the time someone decides to buy a ticket, they're already a huge fan of the artist. I think I saw someone point out in the chat, it's interesting that 25% had never, only 25% are motivated by having never seen the artist before. I think that also speaks to that point that for most concert goers, it's not about you know, seeing someone for the first time or seeing the supporting act lineup, or it's very much, you know, this has been one of my favorite artists for a long time and I'm going to see that person. So while it's long been like a kind of cornerstone of the touring industry that you're building your audiences on the road, you're getting discovered and building fan bases on the road. This data seems to reflect that now it's more about building those audiences elsewhere to the point where you already have this fan base that then is willing to go and buy tickets. So it sort of flips the equation a little bit. I also found it interesting that show production came up so low on here with only 2% being strongly motivated by that. Of course, this is all, we're asking people, you know, what most made you want to attend them. So that doesn't mean that these things aren't enjoyed by concert goers. I'm sure people still like the show production and it's still a big part of their experience. But I think, again, it just goes to show that as long as you have that strong fan base that's willing to go through all these other obstacles to see you, you don't necessarily need the flashiness. So for example, like that John Mayer had a tour sometime in the past year that was just like a stripped back acoustic, like no frills, nothing show, and did seem to do really well. So if you have that fan base, you don't necessarily need all those frills, which I thought was an interesting takeaway. But this is all, again, this is the wider picture, and things start to differ a lot when you start to think about these different profiles that we pulled out. So even though fandom remained the top ticket driver for everyone, there's a lot of other nuance when we start to look at the profiles. So I'll pass it over to Kriss to introduce that part.
Amazing. So yeah, fandom essentially being the unanimous factor. It doesn't matter who you are, that fan aspect is just completely fundamental to pulling the trigger on buying a ticket. But as Tati said, all these other factors are a bit more fluid when you look at the different types of audiences that are out there. And so that's exactly what we're going to get into. right here, which is the personas that we created based on two key factors, which we sort of know to be true, because sometimes we can do segments or personas based on attitudes or based on things which might not necessarily be as tangible. But for this particular project, we really wanted to get into, okay, how much are you spending on live music and how frequently do you go? And we've gone into a bit more granularity with the spend because that is a bit more authoritative, whereas the, going to whether you attend or not can be a bit more subjective, but we've got it split by regularly or very frequently and rarely or occasionally to help mitigate that as well. And the first thing that really comes up is this tiny segment here, the VIPs, and we're not going to really cover those, partly because it's not a big enough sample to really get into. It is interesting that there were some people who really do spend, who don't really go to see live music very much. But for the most part, we're getting into all of these other segments here, which do have quite a sizable base. And right there at the top are the live superfans. So we're seeing people who are spending a lot of money on live music, going very often. And it's easy to think of this segment as, okay, yeah, these are the superfans, got it, crystal clear. But when you look at these selective spenders, these are people who aren't going that often, but they're still spending quite a lot of money. And to be someone who isn't necessarily into live music as much, to still spend that much money, that's really where you get the superfans here of particular artists. So on that top corner, you've got the live superfans who are pretty much superfans of live music and live performing artists as well. But whereas the select spenders, we see that a lot more as an indicator of these are some people who are really quite heavy fans of particular artists as well. And then we've also got these committed regulars. So the largest chunk of the of the fans, other than the occasional fans there at the bottom. And this is a really interesting segment because when we're thinking about, okay, these people are going quite often, going regularly and frequently, they're spending quite a bit. How are they going to change? Because they've got quite a few directions they can go. They could maybe, start spending a bit more and go into that live superfan segment. Or maybe they're not going to go as much over the next year. And we'll definitely get into covering what's going to happen for all of these segments and all these personas as over what they think they're going to be doing over the next year. And then right there at the bottom, people who aren't spending that much. And there's a very sizable segment of people who don't go to live music that often. They don't spend that much as well. But you've also got this really interesting frugal enthusiast segment here. So these are people who are going very frequently and they're not looking for the kind of big ticket, big venue type of show. These are the people who are just going down to your local venue, local, over here in the UK, local pub, local bar. I'm in the US, I'm sure there's a bit more driving to do than we might do over here. But that frugal enthusiast is very keen to get the most value out of their tickets.
I would also quick add with the frugal enthusiasts that everything that we saw about them showed that they are fans of the live experience, more so, or at least in addition to being fans of specific artists. So they were always more likely, they were always over-indexing for things that had to do with just being able to go to more shows regardless of who's playing. Whereas the selective spenders are more about, well, I'm not going that often, so when I do go, I'm going to see Taylor Swift. So you can think about the selective spenders as sort of the audience for those big arena and stadium shows.
Sure. And when we start looking at, okay, what is happening with these personas? And there's so much that we could go into from the report. Just for today, we've decided to go into this, which is the impact of ticket prices and fees and the purchasing experience for these different segments. And you can see here that it's really impacting those that don't go as often. So those selective spenders and occasional fans in particular are really starting to feel the pinch of rising ticket prices, and also the fees and the purchasing experience can be quite off-putting as well. But it's interestingly also impacting this live superfan segment. So this really key segment to the live music industry, people who are going a lot and they're spending a lot. they also have reported that they are finding the experience of buying tickets with all the fees, you know, frustrating as well, and this whole purchasing experience being difficult. And so it's really the dynamic and the state of live music right now is impacting its most valuable fans the most, essentially. And so I think that was a really important finding that we came out with here. And interestingly, those frugal enthusiasts being the least impacted, and largely because, you know, they're not looking at significant fees, they're not looking at significant price rises because they're already starting at such a lower floor of what they're expecting their ticket prices to be. Whereas some of these other segments here really have, you know, quite few opportunities to really go to a big show. And so when they do, they really tend to go for it.
Mhm.
So yeah, over to you, Tati, to talk about how is this going to change over the next year?
Yeah, so starting with kind of the positive news, when we asked compared to 2022, how many live shows will you attend in 2023? The majority of concert goers were going to go to more shows or about the same amount, which, you know, shows that it wasn't just the post-pandemic surge of demand for live music that was like a temporary thing. This is something that's enduring. People are continuing to go to either the same amount of shows or more. Only 15% of concert goers said that they would go to fewer. But then when we start to look at why folks are going to more or less, and how those factors that Kriss just spoke about are impacting them, there's some sort of counterintuitive things that come out of this, I think, because on the one hand, of course, you know, the highest spending fans are going to be most impacted by ticket prices rising because they're the ones that are going to the shows where the prices are rising so much, whereas the, you know, frugal fans or the frugal enthusiasts aren't going to expensive shows anyway. But I think conventional wisdom is usually, oh, you know, inflation is happening, prices are rising, and so the people with less to spend are going to be most impacted. When here we actually see the opposite. It's the people that are used to spending the most that are saying, oh wait, I can't keep spending this much. This is getting out of control. So we found that overall the lowest spending fans, so the frugal enthusiasts and the occasional fans, are actually the most likely to attend more shows next year. And the reasons are usually about favorite artists are touring, there's more local opportunities, or they're just willing to reallocate some of their budget for other things to music. Whereas the higher spending fans, like the selective spenders and the live super fans and the committed regulars, are a bit more likely to attend fewer. I mean, when we look at selective spenders, remember that those are the audiences for arenas and stadiums and kind of the superstar shows. Nearly 1 in 5 said that they're going to attend fewer shows. And the top reason is that tickets are too expensive. So I think this is all really important because especially when you look at, if we hadn't showed this and we were just looking at that data at the beginning about fandom, it would seem that it doesn't matter how expensive things are, fans are still going to go because they love their favorite artists. And, you know, this is why these superstar shows continue to sell out. But I think that this slide and the previous one are really important to highlight that those audiences can't be taken for granted and they're not willing to overspend forever. So I think that's, you know, a really important takeaway here.
Yeah, and I think a good way to almost look at it is if you think of the types of venues that, you know, frugal enthusiasts will go to, just sort of the smaller clubs, smaller bars, 12% fewer fans in those kinds of venues might not necessarily be as big an impact as 19% less fans in a stadium. And I think that's, you know, just kind of have that picture in your head of, you know, if you think of a stadium artist that might not have sold out the stadium. And I know, you know, for instance, in here where I'm based in Glasgow, we had Scissor come down to the SEC Hydro and it didn't sell out. And if you think over the next year, an artist of that kind of stature who is not necessarily selling out the stadium in this particular town, and then you've also got 19% less fans saying they're going to go to those types of shows over the next year, you're looking at quite a big chunk of fans that aren't filling up these stadiums now. So definitely something to bear in mind. And so a big driver of this is, you know, we've talked about fandom, but fandom is fragmenting. It's something we cover a lot at MIDiA Research in the surveys and the projects that we do whether that's on our kind of subscription platform or whether that's bespoke projects for our clients, a lot of it is driven around understanding fandom and how fandom is changing. And one of the things that we do find is that there isn't this big unanimous mainstream fandom, which there might have been in the past. And there are just so many more niches, so many more subcultures, so many more scenes to account for. And that dynamic of fragmenting fandom is coming for live music. And it's important to bear in mind, you know, what are the concerns for that? And also what are the opportunities? And so these are the key takeaways we've got for the study for you today. And over to you, Tati.
Yeah, so as we've talked about, fandom is the biggest factor in a concert goer's decision to buy a ticket. But that fandom isn't necessarily happening, or it's not being created necessarily on the live circuit itself. It's often being built elsewhere, such as, you know, on digital platforms, before then fans are willing to buy a ticket. So I think, you know, of course, if we're not serving the fans, what are we even doing in the music industry? But I think this does kind of put an even more emphasis on building fandom, and perhaps, you know, live teams and artists, fan building and marketing teams working more closely together if they aren't already. And even on that note, we can sort of move beyond this mindset that live has to be the home for all genres. Of course, it's always going to be a big part of the music industry. It's always going to probably be, you know, a big part of, or a part of all artists' careers, but some will have more of a base in live than others. And, you know, that's okay.
Sure. And then this impact on the higher spending concert goers, it is happening. There are going to be a big chunk that might attend fewer concerts over the next year. And so it's really important to understand, okay, these are very serious fans and ticket prices are impacting them, just like rising prices across pretty much everything else in life is impacting them as well. And when you add on top of that fees and purchasing experiences, which, you know, they might just get to a point and say, you know what, nah, not today, not this show. It's just not happening. And so it's really, we see what I'm sort of call to action to start thinking about how can we help these concert goers, because it's not just the ticket price, it's also the cost of the flight for a big percentage of these fans. It's the cost of, you know, the drive to the stadium, you know, all the travel that you might have to do. And so how can the local live music infrastructure essentially be better to help offset these kind of ticket prices and give fans more things to enjoy and go to in their local area at a more affordable and accessible price point?
And also make sure first-time fans aren't put off, right? These aren't just issues that are impacting longtime concert goers, but first timers that might be put off by the experience. And that's, you know, a big issue as well. And then on this final point here, as Kriss was alluding to at the start, we're seeing this massive fragmentation of music listening where people are spreading their listening across way more songs and artists than ever before. And as a result, there's kind of fewer of these new big superstars for everyone and more of these sort of mid-tier cult stars for sort of niches and communities. So we think that as new generations and their genre preferences and also this fragmented listening, as those new generations age up, the future will not only be less rock centric, but it will also just be more fragmented in general. And that might be a world where we have many more flourishing mid-sized venues with many more mid-tier artists touring rather than having, you know, a handful of superstars and then everyone else. So these are the kind of main takeaways that we've got, but the actual report is 22 pages. It's a treasure trove of information. We did our best to give you the, you know, biggest highlights of the report here, knowing that we can't possibly get through everything. So just a note on that, we're happy to, you know, talk more in depth about any of this stuff. That's what the Q&A is for. But I'll just check before we stop if Kriss has any more final words to add to that.
No, I think you covered it pretty comprehensively there. And I think the only thing I'd say is, yeah, thank you all so much for coming to hang out with us and hear about what we found and talk about the future of live music. And we're excited to get into this discussion and get into some of your questions as well.
Great, thank you for the wonderful presentation and very insightful. It's always good to look back and to deep dive into this into data to try to better understand what's going on. And you guys did an amazing job. I mean, it's incredible to see how you were able to make the raw data talk and you know, see through trends across this data. Before we switch to the questions, I was just going to highlight a couple of things that struck me in your report as both challenges and opportunity, but from more, let's say, what matters to Bandsintown, which is to give the equal opportunity to all artists, including of all size and genre, but also included from the rising acts to the most established one. And I think that the discussion that you've had around the risk that inflation and cost may cause to the largest artists and the largest stadium shows is interesting, because it really sets a challenge for all the rest of the artists, actually, to potentially attract these fans and convert them. I mean, the question is, can you convert fandom that usually would go once or twice a year to concerts at stadium to fans that would go and become, let's say, frugal enthusiasts, to take your would go quite often actually into and attend shows of artists that they may not know or they're going to see for the first time. We feel through other pieces of data that this trend was already at work in 2022, with small artists doing 35 more shows than they used to during their tour, so facing or addressing a greater demand. And so we think that there's been some sort of a report, even if it's not mainstream or significant. But as you said, you know, the percentage that you gave of this, what is at risk at the stadium, is far greater than, of course, what is at risk in the smaller venues. So that's an opportunity for smaller acts and indie acts or rising acts, let's say. And I think that the whole challenge is obviously is around discovery. And because that's another challenge that you set right from the get-go of this study, of the introduction of this study, which can feel or build anxiety among our audience, which is, well, a fan seems to go to concerts of artists they already know. Not only they know, but they're already fans of, which is even a step further, right? And that's something that, you know, when you say that fandom may not start on the road, it's true, but it does solidify fandom. It does help to build first-party data. And we think at Bandsintown, at least, that there is no sustainable future for artists that do not own their first-party data. And the only way to efficiently build first-party data, to essentially collect emails and phone number, is to go on tour. So that's one of the things so it's very complementary, if anything. So it may not only build on tour, but it does consolidate on tour. And 25%, I wanted to go back to this data point that shows that 25% of the fans would go to a show to see an artist for the first time. We see in our data that 50% of the ticket clicks on Bandsintown goes to artists of less than 200,000 followers. So we have an algorithm that facilitates discovery, and we push actually, or we recommend these artists to fans, and they eventually buy tickets for these artists, and they may not know actually these artists before. In fact, 50% of our fans admit that they went to a show of an artist they had never heard about before Bandsintown recommendation. So if we connect that to your data point, or to our data points of 25% that would go, I would tell you that we obviously over-index as a population, probably. So our fan base is definitely more committed to go to see artists for the first time. But what I would say is that 25% is not that bad. if you ask me to go, you know, except on a date, maybe to go to a restaurant with someone that I don't know, maybe I won't go. I mean, that's something very hard to ask someone to for entertainment, obviously, to test something that is very, very new. So there's appetite, and there's definitely a huge challenge around discovery, especially at a time when we see the relative disappearance of local bars and small scenes, small stages for like the baby acts, like not even rising or emerging. It's like, you know, the local scene that used to promote super local artists at their very early beginning. And that's a problem, because it was good for discovery, and it was also good for you know, college students and all this kind of crowd that started their journey in music by listening to music at bars and public places. This is unfortunately declining, and so there's definitely a challenge around that. So with that said, I would like to switch to the questions, but I wanted to
respond to a couple of those things.
Oh,
though,
of course.
Because those are all amazing points. And I think there's the challenge that you brought up with discovery. To make it even more challenging, we also found that the audiences that do go to those smaller venues that are more likely to have artists that are looking to get discovered are typically a lot older, which may not be the target audience for a new band that's looking to build their fan base. So yes, absolutely a big challenge. And that you reminded me of a data point that we just didn't have a chance to bring up in the presentation that I'd love to share now, which was we had this question when we started of, well, if prices are so expensive for tickets for the superstars, are we running into an issue where a fan that would normally go to a couple of small shows and one big show is now spending their full budget on the big show, and so the smaller artists are running out of people to come to their shows? That was like a question that we had. So we asked in the survey, if we gave you a $300 budget and to spend annually on concert tickets, and you had to choose from these options, which would you choose? And the options were, you know, I'd splurge on a big superstar show. I'd go to a couple of mid-tier shows. I'd go to many small shows, and I'd do this. I'd splurge on a festival ticket or go towards a festival ticket. And we were actually surprised by the answers, because we thought that most people would splurge on the superstars, but most were wanting to go to either many smaller shows or a handful of mid-tier, which I found super encouraging.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. I think it's a very interesting data point. Indeed, there's some sort of a disconnect that I have trouble to resolve, not in our data or analysis, etc., but in the marketplace, where you're absolutely right. The younger generation, let's say Gen Z, will be less likely to go out anyway. So they spend much more time virtually than any other generation. In fact, there's many other studies that show that, in fact, very worrisome figures about the fact that they are not going out, actually. They're not getting together as much as they used to. But on the other hand, they are eager to support rising acts and emerging artists, because culturally and from a value standpoint, they obviously find that more organic, authentic, and everything. And so, plus they are always eager to be first to discover, I mean, this kind of notion that you'll be first. And to your point, in the respondents or the people who indeed go see this kind of acts, indeed you see some of a generation that are older, so meaning that they've been doing this since they've been younger, and that's concerning. Yes, it's exactly it's very, and that disconnect, but that I'm not losing hope. I think that because we are addressing such important values for the Gen Z around sustainability, authenticity, and real life. And I would say tribal experience for something that we really like at Bandsintown to characterize for concerts. We need to have artists and promoter need to find the right ways to convince this generation to come back to go out, basically, to come back to these places. So there's work to do, but I think there's hope.
Yeah.
So why don't we?
You go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I don't want to run out of time, so I'll let you get on with the questions.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions. We have questions that maybe we're going to start by addressing some of the questions that are related to the way we created the data. Do you think that these data points apply to all kind of genre and all kind of artists? So we have questions around whether it applies to the Latin and jazz or blues. So there's questions around that. So it's is this analysis essentially true across genre, and also is this skewing toward indie artists, or does it really apply to most of the artists, your findings?
Well, we actually have a blog up on MIDiA Research right now on how it in particular differs for hip hop audiences. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat for everyone to get into. And I think ultimately there's a real polarization, which we've seen here, where we've got, as we kind of mentioned before, around the sort of more traditional live kind of formats where you think of rock bands, indie bands, I think maybe like jazz bands and stuff as well, where it does skew towards smaller venues, it skews towards older audiences, and it skews towards concert goers who might spend less but purchase more frequently. And then you've got this hip hop, R&B, pop driven side as well, which is much more around that kind of real sort of big ticket stadium, arena, theater kind of artist as well. And that's a much more kind of less frequent purchase too. It's much more driven by trends and what is kind of charting and what's going sort of viral on TikTok, because it does skew towards younger audiences. And it's one of the things we found in the survey, that it was around a third of 16 to 19-year-olds will discover concerts and gigs that they go to through TikTok. And so that's definitely a dynamic that is affecting younger audiences, and it's affecting those particular types of genres which are resonating more with younger audiences. Whereas if you are in the more, as I say, kind of traditional live, where it is more instrumental, band driven, made for smaller kind of venues, then it is much more of a different type of audience that you're going for.
Yeah, and I would just add, I wouldn't say that the data skews toward independent artists or anything like that. We were asking consumers mainly about shows that they went to over the past year. This was fielded in May 2023, so the year beyond that. And I think if we look at the types of venues that they said they were attending, which were concert halls, theaters, arenas, stadiums, it goes to show that there's a range of different types of artists that were included here. So if anything, I feel like this might have skewed in the opposite direction towards the bigger artists, seeing as the most popular shows were rock concerts at larger venues.
Is there, okay, so do you think that from a geographic standpoint, as MIDiA is based in the UK with questions about the geography, do you feel that the behavior of the fans may be different based on different markets, especially between the US and the UK? Or is this something that any answer that could suggest a difference?
I mean, I think there's surely differences between how, like, if we looked at the US segment and the UK separately, we would probably see some differences in how the concert goers behave. That wasn't part of this report specifically, so we didn't delve into that, and I don't know offhand the answer to it, but I'm sure that there would be differences if we took a look, and that's in the data sheet that comes with this, I believe.
Yeah, I'd also probably just add that there are a lot more of the live music hubs in the UK are in much more, I guess, kind of walkable cities and in places where you can just go down to quite a significant venue by foot, whereas I think there are a lot more places in the US where it is much more of a kind of sparse country, a lot more bigger cities. It does require a bit more just sort of upfront investment in terms of having to, you know, the time and money you commit beyond the ticket towards getting to the gig that you want to go to.
So here we have in the audience, in the chats, apparently lots of artist manager and people from the touring industry. But I know that MIDiA is in constant contact with labels and the recorded side of the industry as well. And so can you share some of the, can you share some of the reactions you got when you shared this data with that side of the music industry? Especially because we know that labels and, essentially, the recorded side of the industry always try to expand beyond the recorded music. And there was a time when there was 360 agreement, and there are still some of them, etc. What your point on the synergies between and the way to build fandom before the tour and during the tour and probably after the tour suggests that there might be a good logic for the labels to get more involved in the marketing of the let's say the entertainment of the fandom, the build-up of the fandom. How did they react to your findings? Is there anything you can share?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally the labels that we speak to are becoming a lot more attuned to this fragmentation aspect that we've been talking about and how it's impacting them. I know there's been, a lot of stories. There was one last week about labels saying, oh, we're trying to break stars and nothing is working. And we think that's the fragmentation at play. So I think it just has added another layer when they've started to look at how that then impacts live. And one of the big conversations or the consensus it feels from everyone in the music industry is that in the past couple of years, focus on virality and all these things, artist development has suffered. And there was one executive that we spoke to, I won't say who it was, that was saying, well, if we're not developing artists the way that we used to, why wouldn't the live industry be impacted by that? Because then we're not getting these artists that are kind of ready to go and have these fan bases and are getting to the point where they're a Taylor Swift that can sell out these stadiums across the world. So I think there is a recognition that these objectives are linked and that there needs to be more of a synergy, as you put it, Bruce. Fabrice, not Bruce.
Okay, it's not an insult.
And using that word because, again, yeah, we don't want to advocate for 360 deals and going back to that, but I think there is a recognition that building fan bases is becoming the most important thing, and so this report definitely brought up a bit of that.
Do you think that artists are, therefore, do you see management companies taking more control and trying to get more involved in the build-up of the fan base, the management of the fan base, the acquisition of and the ownership of the first-party data, for example?
Well, I was just going to come in there and say that, even with the labels, sort of, if they were wanting to invest more in kind of that building fandom and supporting the live aspect, it's still up to the artists and their managers to say, you know what, this is the deal that, we'll take. And for a lot of artists and managers, even in quite prominent positions, they might say, it's worth taking the risk of putting on a tour on ourselves, as long as we've kind of got control over it and we can make our own decisions and we can do the tour the way we want to, because it can be quite grueling and it's becoming more and more expensive to put on a tour as well. I think for a lot of artists, they might be willing to take that risk and bet on themselves. And so you will see more of the kind of managers and more of the artists taking on doing things independently. I think there will still be many that will want to have that support, and if they've got a label that they really trust and really get on with and really work well with, then they'd be happy to do that deal.
Great. I'm going to take a last question from the audience. We have questions about merch. Did we ask questions about merch, and to which extent do we know which generation is most spending money on merch items?
We didn't ask. So the only thing we asked about in the survey was where merch factors in for buying a ticket, exclusive merch, and it fell pretty low. In terms of what generation is buying merch most, we track that data for MIDiA. I don't know it offhand, but I would assume that it's younger ones. I can check. Let me see.
While you get that up, so in that data, for even with looking at the opportunity to buy exclusive merchandise, it like Tati said, it wasn't very much at all. But we did see the responses for that increase gradually for younger audiences. So if you think of, that kind of over 55 segment versus the 16 to 19, there was a lot more 16 to 19-year-olds who wanted to get merch than over 55s, put it that way.
Yeah, but looking at the data that we have for this at MIDiA, the age bracket that's most likely to buy merchandise is actually 35 to 44s. And I think that makes sense when you think about that. This is an age range that, is still kind of young enough that music is still a really important part of your life, but old enough that you have disposable income to spend on merch. So I think that age range actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but that's also the core of the concert goer, really. It's definitely, it can be sometimes counterintuitive, but yes, it's older than what you think.
Yeah.
Guys, I think it's time to close this conversation. So I hope we were able to provide insights, and I thank you so much for this very valuable study. I think the market hasn't seen such a study published for a long time. So it's going to be a landmark study and people will refer to it for some time. I know that our interest will continue to be to support artists and managers and that part of the community. So stay tuned, because we may come up with additional data and more studies in covering other sides of the live music industry. So thank you very much for attending. We're really happy to have you here, and we are obviously available if you want to chat or interact after this conversation.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I saw someone say we need another hour, and I agree. I wish we had one. This has been great. Thank you for joining.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And just a reminder that the webinar was recorded and all of you will get a link to playback. I think the questions were just fabulous, and all of us will be looking for ways to try and answer more of them in the coming weeks and months. So thanks so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.